They said it was a family-only meeting. So why were they standing on land with my name on the deed, a private meeting? No one told me, but I knew why. They never truly saw me as family. I didn't cry, didn't knock, didn't ask why. I simply printed a certified copy of the land deed, held it in my hand, and walked forward while they sat under that porch, laughing, talking, as if I didn't exist, and I said only one thing. Before y'all keep talking business, maybe check whose land you're on. My name is Janelle Monroe. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my life, I was the invisible one. You see, I was born in Savannah, Georgia. My mother had me young from a whirlwind relationship with her first husband, David Monroe. He died in a car crash when I was 5, and just like that, I became a living memory everyone wanted to forget. When Mom remarried, things changed. Fast. Her new husband, Frank, he had charm, and 2 kids from a previous marriage. Soon, we became a blended family. At least, that's what they called it. But I always knew I wasn't really blended in. I was tolerated, like a stain on a white shirt. They called me polite, quiet, independent. What they meant was not one of us. Family dinners, I'd set the table, but I wasn't part of the toasts. Vacations, I'd be sent to stay with Aunt Myrtle. They said it was for my own peace of mind, but I knew. I wasn't welcome in their picture-perfect portraits. Even as a teenager, when I got straight A's, no one clapped. But when Frank's kids passed summer school with C's, they threw a barbecue. I stopped trying to earn their affection, and instead, I built a quiet world of my own. Books, music, late-night journaling by the window of my childhood room, the one facing the field, where my dad once planted lemon trees before he died. No one ever went back there, except me. Years passed. I graduated early, moved out, got a degree in real estate management, while they stayed in that big country house, calling themselves tight-knit. But that tightness only squeezed me out further. I still visited birthdays, holidays, Mother's Day, but I always felt like a guest. No one said it, but it was in their eyes. I didn't belong. Then Mom got sick. The calls were brief, updates vague. I offered to help. They said they had it under control. I wanted to stay overnight. They said, "There's no space." So I prayed quietly and drove back home. She passed away in spring, April 19th, 10:47 a.m. They didn't even call me. I found out from the hospice nurse, who recognized me as Janelle, her eldest. I cried in the parking lot of a grocery store, and no one even knew. At the funeral, I sat in the 3rd row. Because the first 2 were reserved, I wasn't asked to speak. But when the priest read Mom's final letter, he ended with one line that made everyone shift uncomfortably. To my first daughter, Janelle, you were always my quiet anchor. They glanced back at me, but I didn't return the look, because I'd already learned to survive without their gaze. A week after the funeral, they hosted a family meeting at the old property, the one my dad built, the one Mom kept. They didn't invite me, not a word, not a message. I only knew because one of the neighbors, a sweet old man named Curtis, called me that morning. Said he saw a bunch of folks gathering on the porch. "Thought you'd be there too," he said. I smiled and said I had other plans. But in reality, I grabbed my keys and drove out to the land that raised me. The dirt road, the broken gate, the porch swing that squeaked just slightly off center. They were all still there. And so were they. 7 people, sitting in a circle like royalty, laughter, wine, clipboard in hand, probably deciding what to do with the barn, the acres, the future, without me. I didn't walk up. I just stood at the edge of the field, watching, letting the breeze hit my face as I remembered the lemon tree stump still hidden in the tall grass. They didn't know, but I did. Because 2 years before Mom passed, she called me in secret, told me she was tired of the noise, the politics, the pressure. She wanted the land to go to someone who saw it for what it really was. So we met with a lawyer, signed every page, got it notarized. That land was mine. And they were sitting on it, with no clue, calling it theirs, holding their little family-only meeting, on soil that had my father's name and my mother's signature. And soon, my comeback. They say silence is powerful. But that day, my silence roared louder than every voice on that porch. I didn't storm up there. I didn't scream or demand answers. No. I stood by the tree line, arms crossed, watching the people who shared my blood, but never my heart. I could hear them. Frank, my stepfather, was speaking loud enough for the birds to scatter. Something about converting the barn into a retreat space, about leveraging the land for generational wealth. It was ironic, really. He never stepped foot in that barn when Mom was alive. But now, suddenly, he had visions of a legacy. The others chimed in. My step-siblings Haley and Brent nodded along. Haley said she could host weddings there. Brent joked about building an outdoor bar. Someone mentioned adding cabins. Another, an Airbnb listing. They called it a Monroe family compound. They said that name like it meant something to them. But that name was mine. Every time they spoke, I sank deeper into memory. The broken wheelbarrow Dad once used, the way Mom hung lavender by the kitchen window, the summers I spent repainting the fence by myself because no one else cared. This land held more than dirt. It held echoes. And none of them knew what it meant. Until I stepped forward, not rushed, not angry. I walked slow, deliberate. The sound of gravel crunching beneath my boots silenced their laughter. One by one, they turned. Brent squinted. Haley's smile faded. My stepfather stood tall, but his eyes flickered, like he already knew. Something was coming. Oh, Haley said, crossing her arms, didn't expect you. I tilted my head. I figured. Frank tried to recover. Well, you're here now. Take a seat. He gestured to a weathered chair with one cracked leg. The only one not already taken. I didn't sit. Instead, I pulled a red file from my leather bag, unsnapped the clasp, removed the documents slowly, and laid them on the table like a final hand in a poker game. No words, just the sound of paper sliding over wood. Heavy, final. Brent leaned forward. Haley glanced, scoffed, then froze. Frank reached for the top page. His hand trembled just slightly. The notary stamp, the county seal, the title transfer, the signature from the late Margaret Monroe, my mother. And beneath it all, my name, Janelle A. Monroe, legal owner of Parcel 742, comprising 11.6 acres of private property, including the house, the barn, the land they stood on. What is this? Frank finally asked. His voice cracked just a bit. I met his eyes. Proof. This is ridiculous, Haley spat. Mom wouldn't I cut her off. She did. 2 years ago. Quietly. Legally. I took a breath. She told me she was tired of the performance. She wanted the land to go to someone who saw its roots, not just its market value. Brent chuckled, but it lacked confidence. So, what, you gonna kick us off? I didn't flinch. No. Then I paused. Let that word hang. Until I said the second part. Not yet. They didn't laugh. Not anymore. Frank puffed his chest. You think a piece of paper changes the fact that this is our family home? No, I said. But it changes who gets to call the shots. They stared at me like they didn't recognize the girl they once ignored. And maybe they didn't. Because I wasn't a girl anymore. I was a woman. A woman who carried every silent insult, every dismissal, every she's not really one of us, and turned it into steel. Frank stepped forward, tried to speak again, but I raised my hand, not loud, just firm, and he stopped. I'm not here to argue, I said. I'm not here for revenge. I looked around the table, but I'm also not here to be erased. I could feel the heat rising in my chest, but I kept my voice calm, measured. I was left out of this meeting, deliberately. But next time, if there is a next time, it happens on my terms. I tapped the deed. Because, whether you like it or not, this is my land. No one moved, no one spoke. The wind blew, a chair creaked. Somewhere in the distance, a bird cawed shrill, high, as if mocking them. I took one last look at the people who spent decades acting like I didn't exist. And then I did something they never expected. I smiled. Not out of spite, but out of peace. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't need their seat at the table. I owned the ground beneath it. I turned, walked back to my car, and as I drove off, dust trailing behind me like a signature in the air, I whispered 3 words not for them. For me, I am home. As I drove, my fingers tightened around the steering wheel. Not from anger, no, that had passed, but from release. Years of swallowing silence finally exhaled. But the moment kept replaying, their faces, their stunned silence. Haley's mouth parted like she wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Brent, fidgeting with his sleeves like a child about to be scolded. Frank, staring at the deed as if it were written in a language he never bothered to learn. For the first time, they had no script, no control, no ability to twist the narrative, because I didn't yell, I didn't beg, I just presented the truth. And the truth doesn't need permission to exist. When I got home, I poured myself a cup of tea. Chamomile. Calming. But my hand still shook a little. Not from fear. Not anymore. It was adrenaline, the kind that comes not from fighting, but from finally being free. I sat on my porch, watched the streetlights flicker on, and I smiled as I opened my journal. The same one I used to write in as a child, curled under a blanket, wondering why I never felt chosen. This time, I wrote something different. Today, I did not ask for a place. I claimed it. And just as I set down my pen, my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. It read, "We need to talk." No name. But I knew who it was. Frank, of course. I didn't reply. Not yet. Let him sit in the silence I had to live in for decades. Tomorrow, there would be lawyers, questions, maybe even threats. But tonight, I had peace. And I knew exactly where it came from, the land, the legacy, the truth. And finally, my voice. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The sun had barely broken through the curtains, but my mind was already racing. Not with doubt, no. That part of me had gone quiet. But with a strange clarity, the kind that comes after standing in your truth and watching it echo. I made coffee, black, no sugar, poured it into the chipped mug that used to sit in Mom's kitchen, the one with the tiny lemon print she'd always loved. Then I sat at the table, opened my laptop, and began to read through emails I'd ignored for too long. There were 3 from Frank, 2 from Haley, 1 from Brent, and 1 from a lawyer I didn't recognize. His firm's name was tidy and expensive-looking, Roland, Marks and Peters. The subject line read, "Clarification request, parcel 742. I didn't even flinch. Instead, I hit reply and sent them a copy of the deed with a brief, pointed note. All rights and ownership transferred per notarized agreement, effective 2023. If further questions remain, feel free to contact my counsel." That was it. No threats, no drama, just truth. It felt like breathing clean air after years in a smoke-filled room. By noon, the phone calls started. First from Haley. I didn't answer. Then Brent. I sent him to voicemail. Then, predictably, Frank again. This time, I picked up. Not because I owed him anything, but because I needed to hear what guilt sounded like from a man who never once apologized to me. "Janelle," he started, voice strained. Can we talk? I stayed silent. He cleared his throat. We didn't know. Your mother never told us. I let out a soft laugh. That's the point, Frank. She didn't trust you to know. He went quiet, then tried again. You have to understand, this affects a lot of people. The family I cut in? No. What affects people is thinking they can erase someone and never face the cost. Another pause. Then the question I knew was coming. What are you going to do with it? Ah, there it was. The question behind every fake smile, every let's talk, control. They wanted to know if I'd tear down their little fantasy, if I'd evict them, bulldoze the barn, sell the land to developers. And for a moment, I considered it. But revenge is loud, and I'd lived too long in silence to waste this moment shouting. I don't know yet, I said, but I'll decide it on my own. Click. I ended the call. That afternoon, I drove back to the land, not for confrontation, but for clarity. It was quiet. No cars, no voices, just wind and wild grass. I parked near the fence and walked the perimeter. Every stone, every tree, every echo. I remembered being 8, hiding behind the shed when Haley laughed at my shoes. I remembered Brent throwing my journals in the creek, Frank telling Mom, "She's too sensitive. You spoil her." And yet, this land loved me better than they ever did. It remembered me. At the back of the property, behind the barn, was the old swing my father built, still standing, still sturdy. I sat on it, like I did when I was 12, let the ropes creak, closed my eyes, and I knew this wasn't just about property. It was about peace. It was about returning to what was always mine. I spent the next 2 days drafting a plan, not to punish, but to preserve. I contacted an environmental trust, told them I wanted to convert the land into a conservation site, a place for reflection, solitude, healing, no events, no parties, no profit, just peace. The woman I spoke to, Maria, sounded surprised. Most people want to monetize, she said. Most people weren't forgotten by their own blood, I replied. She understood. By the end of the week, I signed a preliminary agreement. The land would remain untouched, protected, private, and under my name. I made one exception. I placed a single wooden bench near the lemon tree stump, with a brass plaque that read, "In memory of Margaret Monroe, the quiet roots beneath every storm." When the family found out, the messages came flooding again. Some angry, some pitiful. Frank said I was being spiteful. Haley called me emotionally manipulative. Brent just said, "You win." But it wasn't about winning. It was about ending. Ending the cycle. Ending the noise. Ending the part of me that still waited to be invited in, because I was never outside. They just never looked up long enough to see me holding the foundation. And now I don't wait for chairs at tables I own. I don't explain truth to people who prefer fiction. I don't knock on doors built on my land. I just live fully, quietly, powerfully, the kind of power that doesn't need to shout, because it's written into the soil itself. Signed, stamped, and finally, seen. That weekend, I received a letter, a real one, on thick ivory paper, sealed with wax. It was from Aunt Caroline, Mom's only sister. We hadn't spoken in nearly 5 years. She wrote, "Janelle, I heard what you did. I know what they're saying, but I also know your mother. And if she gave you that land, it's because she trusted you to protect it, not exploit it. I'm proud of you. I should have said that sooner. Loved, Caroline." I read it twice, then again, because it was the first time anyone in that family had called me protector. Not a burden, not a mistake, not her daughter from the first marriage, but someone worth honoring. I folded the letter gently and placed it in the back of my journal. A reminder that not all roots are rotten. Some are just buried deep, waiting for light. 2 weeks later, I visited Mom's grave. No flowers. She wasn't that type. Just a quiet hello. I sat beside her headstone and told her everything. The meeting, the deed, the bench, the land trust. And I said, softly, I hope you're proud of me. The wind picked up just a little, enough to rustle the leaves, enough to feel like a nod, like maybe, just maybe, she was. And as I stood to leave, I glanced back one last time, not with sadness, but with closure, because what they tried to erase had already been written in full, by her hand, by my choice, and by the land that never forgot me. Later that evening, I hosted a dinner, not for them, for me. I set one plate, one glass, one candle, cooked lemon herb chicken, Mom's old recipe, and I played her favorite vinyl on the record player. For the first time in years, I felt whole. No pretending, no hoping for invitations that would never come. I had chosen myself. I had protected what mattered. And I had turned silence into sanctuary. The land outside sat quiet, bathed in moonlight, still mine, still sacred. And as the record spun its final note, I raised my glass to the night air and whispered, she gave me roots, and I built wings. Some people think revenge means fire, destruction, explosions, headlines. But what I learned is that real power doesn't burn everything down. It leaves what needs to be seen still standing. It had been a month since I revealed the deed. And while the messages from Frank's side of the family slowed to a drip, the ripple hadn't stopped. One morning, I received an email from the county clerk. Subject request to amend historical property records. I opened it slowly. They had submitted a formal appeal to have the deed reviewed, claiming undue influence and lack of transparency. I laughed, quiet, bitterly, because if they'd known anything about Mom, they'd know she was never unclear. I forwarded the message to my lawyer, Thomas Avery. He called back within the hour. It's nothing, he said calmly. They're grasping at air. You followed every protocol, signed, sealed, witnessed, but something in me still tightened, not from fear, but from the feeling of being chased by ghosts who refused to stay buried. That evening, I drove to the courthouse, not because I had to, but because I wanted to walk through that building, wearing confidence like armor. Room 2B, Land and Property Archives. I met with the clerk, showed my copy of the deed, and asked to verify the public record. He nodded, typed a few things, then turned the screen. There it was. Line 12, owner Janelle A. Monroe, confirmed. I thanked him, walked back out to the parking lot, and stood in the sun, eyes closed, breathing deep. The thing about being erased for so long is that even truth can feel like a hallucination. But seeing it, stamped in a government system, that's when it started to feel real. I had the title, I had the legal standing, and now I had clarity. Still, the news of the Conservation Trust made waves. I began getting calls from local developers, people offering 6 figures. One guy even offered equity in his eco-retreat chain, but I rejected every one of them. Because my worth wasn't measured in offers, it was measured in silence, the good kind, the kind that echoes peace. Then came the family's final move, a gathering, one they actually invited me to. Haley sent the message herself. We'd like to talk in person, just us, one more time. For a split second, I considered ignoring it, but something about the tone, it wasn't condescending. It wasn't even manipulative. It was tired. So I went. Sunday afternoon, back at the house. They were already there. No fancy setup this time, just folding chairs. No wine. No laughter. Haley stood when I arrived. Brent nodded. Frank was the last to look up. His eyes were different. Older. Not in years, just worn. Thanks for coming. Haley started. Her voice wasn't cold. It was cautious. like someone stepping into a river they no longer owned. We've talked, Brent said, a lot, and we realized some things. I didn't speak, just listened. Haley cleared her throat. We treated you badly, for years. Not just after Mom died, but before. Long before. She looked down. I used to think you were just quiet because you were distant, cold. She blinked. But now I think, maybe you were just surviving. Frank exhaled. When he spoke, his voice cracked for the first time I could remember. Your mother. She knew things we didn't. She saw what we refused to. He looked straight at me. You've always had a strength none of us understood. I felt the lump rise in my throat, but I didn't let it bloom. Not yet. Brent pulled something from his coat. A photo. Old. Faded. It was me. 7 years old. Sitting on the porch, holding a lemon in both hands. The lemon tree behind me. Still tall. Still whole. Mom was kneeling beside me, mid-laugh. A moment I didn't even remember existing. But someone Mom had saved it. Brent handed it to me. Didn't say anything. I looked at it for a long time. Then I whispered. Without lifting my eyes, she gave me the land. Because she knew I'd never sell it for a seat at a table that never made room for her either. Silence followed, but this time it was sacred, not hostile, not cold, just real. When I stood to leave, Haley grabbed my hand. For the first time in forever. You don't owe us anything, she said, but if you ever decide to build something out there, something for the community, for healing, we'd like to help. I nodded, didn't promise, didn't deny, because maybe forgiveness isn't a clean break. Maybe it's a long, quiet road that you walk barefoot, and maybe some days you stop, sit, remember. But you keep walking anyway. That night, I lit a candle beside Mom's photo, wrote a letter I'd never send, telling her everything, and at the very end, I added, they finally saw me, Mom, but more importantly, I saw myself. I folded the letter, placed it in the soil by the lemon tree, and for the first time in my life, I cried, not because I was hurt, but because I was finally whole. A few days later, I went back to the property one more time, not to check on anything, just to be there, to breathe where my mother once breathed, to walk barefoot on the earth that remembered me. The sun was warm, the wind soft. I sat on the bench I'd placed near the lemon tree stump, fingers tracing the brass plaque. It was weathered already just a little. Time always moves forward, even when the past tries to cling to your ankles. Across the field, birds landed, 2 of them, then 3, then more. They sang, not loudly, just enough to be heard, and I smiled, because I no longer needed approval, no longer craved a voice calling me worthy. The land had already spoken, and it said, you were always here. Later that week, I got a letter in the mail from the Conservation Trust. Final approval. The land would be registered in the State Preservation Registry, which meant no one could ever build over it. No resort. No parking lot. No concrete path cutting through its memory. It would stay wild, free, like Mom, like me. I printed the certificate, framed it, hung it in my hallway, right next to my degree, because both were earned, and both were mine. Some people inherit money, some get houses. I got roots, soil, and a story I will never let them rewrite again. Because no matter how loud they speak now, the land already remembers who stood quiet and stayed. One evening, weeks later, I was invited to speak at a local women's circle. They had heard about the story, about the land, about the silence that became sovereignty. I was nervous, but I stood there, under soft lights and attentive eyes, and told the truth. You don't need to shout to reclaim what's yours. Sometimes, the quietest woman in the room holds the deed. When I stepped down, Someone hugged me. Someone else cried. But me, I just breathed. Because when you've been unseen for so long, being seen by yourself is the most powerful thing of all. Closure doesn't always come with applause. Sometimes it arrives on a quiet morning when you wake up and no longer feel the need to explain yourself. That's how it felt, a stillness, like all the weight I'd carried since childhood had finally set itself down, not because it disappeared, but because I no longer needed to carry it alone. In the months that followed, life began to unfold in quiet, deliberate ways. I planted a new lemon tree near the same stump where the old one stood. I knelt in the dirt, hands deep in soil, and whispered to the roots, "Grow however you want. No pressure to be perfect. Just grow." Some days, I still got letters. From cousins who once ignored me. From people who heard a version of the story and wanted to know the truth. But I never gave them the full version. Because the truth, it didn't belong to gossip. It belonged to growth. And I was done performing, done defending, done shrinking. Instead, I created a small retreat space, not for profit, but for peace. A quiet wooden cabin facing east, where sunlight could spill in through the trees. I called it the Anchor, named after the word my mother used for me. Her quiet anchor. People came, women mostly. Some hurt, some healing, all searching. They came to sit beneath the trees, to write, to breathe. I didn't guide them. I simply gave them space to remember who they were. One woman, Clara, sat with me on the porch one evening. She'd lost everything in a divorce. She said, "I didn't know where else to go, but when I heard your story, I thought, maybe I'm not crazy. Maybe I'm just starting over." I handed her a cup of tea and said, "Starting over doesn't mean starting empty." She cried, and I did too, because somewhere in her grief, I recognized mine, and somewhere in my healing, she saw her path begin. Word spread, slowly, naturally. The land became more than a boundary line. It became a beginning, not just for me, but for anyone who'd ever been told, "You don't belong." One day, I received an invitation. A local university wanted me to speak on legacy and land ownership. It felt surreal. Me, once the girl no one invited to family meetings, now being asked to teach others about what it means to own something, to claim it, to protect it with more than legal papers with intention. When I stood at that podium, I didn't quote law books or statistics. I spoke plainly, like this inheritance is not just what we receive, it's also what we refuse to pass on. I paused, let it breathe, then continued. I didn't keep the land to build fences. I kept it to break cycles, to create space, to turn silence into sanctuary. The room was quiet. Then someone clapped. Then another. And suddenly, it was a storm of hands. But I didn't cry. Not this time. Because I had already cried in private. This was for the little girl who once wrote poems by the window and wondered if anyone would ever listen. Now they were listening. On the 1-year anniversary of Mom's passing, I hosted a gathering. Not a memorial, not a eulogy, just remembrance. A circle of chairs beneath the oak trees, a table with lemon pie and lavender tea. I read one of her journal entries aloud. "If Janelle ever reads this, know that you don't have to fight to be seen. One day, they'll turn around. But more importantly, you'll already be walking forward." No one spoke afterward. They didn't need to. The sky turned gold. The wind picked up, and somewhere, just beyond the trees, I swore I could hear her laugh. I stayed late that evening. Everyone else had left. The candles still flickered on the table. I walked the land one last time for the day. Felt the soil beneath my feet. I whispered, "I am not what they said I was. I am what you knew I could be." And the trees listened, like they always did. Later that night, I looked through an old box of letters from Mom. Tucked inside was a folded page I'd missed before. in her handwriting. You will inherit not only this land, but the silence I once had to keep. Break it. Gently, but fully. So I did, not with vengeance, but with vision, with voice, and with a kind of power that doesn't need to shout because it's rooted and rising. The next morning, I began something new. A small journal, bound in leather, the kind Mom used to write in. I titled the first page, What I'm Building Now. And I wrote, I'm building peace that doesn't ask permission. I'm building a story where silence is no longer shame. I'm building spaces where forgotten women remember themselves. And I'm building a life that doesn't shrink when someone else enters the room. Every morning, I added more, not plans, not goals, but reminders of what power looks like when it's quiet. Then, in late spring, I got a letter. This time, from a high school teacher I barely remembered. She'd seen my story in a local article about land restoration. She wrote, You always sat in the back row, never raised your hand. But when you wrote essays, we read them out loud in the teacher's lounge. We knew you had something. I'm glad the world finally knows, too. I sat with that letter for hours, because it reminded me of every moment I'd been invisible yet still left traces. That week, I printed the story, the full one, bound it like a book, not to publish, just to place on the shelf beside Mom's journals. Because her legacy wasn't just what she left me, it was what she allowed me to become. And one day, maybe decades from now, if a young woman wanders through my retreat, lost, quiet, trying to remember who she is, and stumbles across that book, she'll know that her silence has strength, that her roots have meaning, and that even when the world doesn't invite her to the table, she can build her own, brick by brick, page by page, tree by tree. That summer, a young girl named May came to the retreat with her aunt. She was 11, shy, barely spoke, but she wandered the fields every day, her notebook always open. One afternoon, I found a page she had left on the bench by the lemon tree. It said, This place feels like someone finally said yes to me, like I can grow here. I folded it gently and tucked it in my journal. Because May's words were the proof that healing isn't just personal, it's generational. And sometimes, the best revenge isn't proving them wrong. It's proving yourself right so the next girl never has to beg for her name to be seen. She'll already know because the land remembers, and now, so do we.